Dear colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you all at MGIMO today. In addition to the faculty and students, we're glad to have our distinguished guests here, so I will introduce myself. My name is Andrey Sushentsov. I'm the Dean of the School of International Relations at MGIMO University. Today, we're opening a series of lectures that will focus on the Ukrainian crisis and its various dimensions, including the global implications of the crisis, which will be the subject of my today's lecture. It was our students who initiated and organized this series of lectures, Yelizaveta Rudenko and Matvey Tsarov being the most active ones. I would like to thank them for their amazing work today. Seeing the energy of our students channeled in the right direction is indeed very rewarding. The subject of our today's lecture is the Ukrainian crisis and its global consequences. Undoubtedly, one lecture will not be enough to cover this topic, so I will focus on its two key aspects. Firstly, the European security crisis, which was probably the main driving force behind this crisis, and the delayed crisis in Russian-Ukrainian relations. If we try to succinctly explain the linear logic of Russian-Western relations, which first led to the escalation of tensions in Europe and then triggered this crisis, it can be described as follows. The West has the initiative and is constantly expanding its sphere of influence in Europe closer to the Russian borders, focusing not only on Europe, but on other important regions as well, all the while trying to present its own security system, pivoted on the United States, as a universal one. What lies at the heart of this strategy, which was set out in the early 90s under the Bill Clinton administration, is a metaphor that was employed by Anthony Lake, National Security Advisor to the Clinton administration, in his speech at Johns Hopkins University. When addressing the students and the faculty, he said that during the Cold War, one could succinctly explain the US strategy against the USSR looking at a map where blue and red areas clashed. Today, at great risk of oversimplification, we might visualize our security mission as promoting the enlargement of the blue areas of market democracies. Throughout the Cold War, we contained a global threat to market democracies. Now we should seek to enlarge their reach, particularly in places that are of special significance to us. Framing the issue like that sounds a bit ideologically deterministic, even Marxist in a way. History moves in a certain direction, it has an end, there's a right and a wrong side, and everything the United States does is on the right side of history. Thus, countries that do not bow to the United States and act independently are on the wrong side of history. This propagandist concept, quite realistic in its infancy, when it was proposed in the early years of the Cold War, eventually started to increasingly trump strategic considerations. This policy gradually started lacking in rational, sober, calculated steps, relying solely on ideology instead. In the early 90s, Russia also succumbed to this determinism and huge public expectations it had created. The first Yeltsin administration, including Foreign Minister Andrey Sushentsov, seemed to share the ideas the US presented as an ideological framework for the new world, the ideas of freedom, free trade, liberalization, and democratization. For instance, in his notorious 1992 publication in the Survival magazine, Russian Foreign Minister Andrey Sushentsov suggested that the only way for Russia to survive was to join the West, that is, to allow Americans to implement their strategy. However, already during Yeltsin's administration, a critical analysis of Russia's national interests began to show that following this American strategy jeopardizes Russian interests. This tension, completely objective in nature, began to accumulate back then. It became clear there were more to this American strategy than ideas Russia readily accepted at the time. Behind it were the military capabilities, the coercive capabilities that Americans didn't hesitate to use. They are willing to use force in circumstances when they feel progress is not being made fast enough, or when there is an opportunity to speed up the process in order to reach the right endpoint of history. At first, this was merely irritating. Then it started causing Russia's increasingly active resistance. Leading Western analysts also predicted that the era of Russia meekly following America's lead would inevitably come to an end. Russians would finally come to their senses and retaliate. One of the people to actively promote this idea in the mainstream American media was George Kennan, one of the founding fathers of the containment strategy. In a plethora of publications and interviews in the mid to late 90s, he stated that a new Cold War was beginning. The expansion of NATO was completely unwarranted, that it was a disastrous mistake, and that Russians would eventually react, and their reaction would be completely different from what was expected, despite the fact that they would probably swallow the bitter pill of NATO expansion at the time. This prophecy from his 1998 interview has become quite prescient if you take a look at how events have unfolded since then. But as tensions in Russian-Western relations began to rise, even Andrey Kozyrev was forced to take active and sometimes unconventional steps to demonstrate Russia's deep-seated dissatisfaction with the way events were starting to unfold. There was one particular incident that went down in history. It took place at the meeting of the CSCE Council of Ministers in Stockholm in 1992. The Cold War had just ended. A new government came into power in Moscow, and the foreign minister was said to be pro-Western. And then he took the stage and delivered a short, vivid, and very tough speech to an audience of foreign ministers, national security advisors, experts, and journalists. The key points of the speech were that Russia was strongly opposed to any NATO expansion to the east and would have to respond if that were to take place. Russia would protect the rights of Russians in the post-Soviet space and overall viewed the Western Bloc as hostile. Having said that, in under 5 minutes, he left the stage, causing a sense of shock in the entire audience. Western officials were perplexed by what had just happened, as they expected him to say completely different things. After a while, Kozyrev returned to the floor and said that the speech had been a stunt intended as a wake-up call to the West. He said that we all had a huge job to do, create an inclusive security system on the European continent that was not targeted against Russia. Russia must be part of this system, he said. And if it is not, the next Russian foreign minister will mean what I've just told you. And he'll mean every word of it. This speech provoked many reactions, and witnesses of those events recall the episode as one of that really influenced their understanding of the strategic situation in Russian-Western relations at the time. Still, it had no profound consequences. In a plethora of other speeches in the early 1990s, Russia's top-ranking officials used similar theses in earnest. In his 1994 Budapest address, Boris Yeltsin said that Europe, not having yet freed itself from the legacy of the Cold War, is in danger of plunging into a cold peace, meaning a system of interaction full of hostility and mistrust, which would gradually lay the groundwork for a system of mutual deterrence. Another famous example is Russian President Vladimir Putin's speech to the Bundestag that he delivered in German. The most quoted part of this speech is probably the one about the common future of Russia and Europe. But a significant part of the same speech was dedicated to a major structural problem of European security, the existence of NATO and its expansion to the east, and the disagreement with Russia over the issue. These same theses were succinctly expounded on and given as a clear warning in Vladimir Putin's Munich speech in 2007, and have been repeated by the Russian leadership many times ever since. The last major warning, in fact, was voiced in November and December of last year, when Moscow came out with a series of diplomatic initiatives containing all the same points that have been discussed since the beginning of the 90s. So, is it fair to say that Western analysts and experts misunderstood the nature of Russia's demands? Or did they just prefer not to understand them fully? Unfortunately, we cannot draw such a conclusion. The materials made public by WikiLeaks in 2008, drawn up by American diplomats across the globe, including the US Embassy in Moscow, show a very high level of awareness and understanding of Russia's position. For instance, the current head of the CIA, William Burns, was the US ambassador to Moscow at the time. He belongs to the generation of American leaders who still know how to think strategically. And these materials show that Americans are acutely aware of Russia's standpoint. They know how sensitive Moscow is to pressure on its interests in Eastern Europe. Moreover, they express great surprise at Moscow's willingness to defend its interests to the point of using force. There are two very important memos from the US Embassy in Russia. The first one is called "Нет means нет," which means no. It is easy to find in Google. It outlines Russia's red lines regarding NATO expansion and the Ukrainian crisis. This note contains a rather important statement that the issue of Ukraine's admission to NATO is, first and foremost, of vital importance to Russia, and is, secondly, extremely polarizing for Ukrainian society. This issue, if raised quickly and without due preparation, could potentially cause civil confrontation and even a civil war. In that case, Russia will have to interfere, the note reads, even if it does not want to. This allows us to conclude that Americans were well aware of both Russia's interests and its willingness to defend them. In February of that same year, seeing the growing tension between Moscow and Washington, William Burns sent another memo, in which he stated that a direct military clash was far from impossible. This involved three issues that the United States was trying to get Moscow to agree to. The first was the Membership Action Plan for Ukraine and Georgia, the second was the recognition of Kosovo, and the third was the deployment of a missile defense system in Europe. As the Bush administration tried to push these three issues simultaneously in his final year of presidency, Bill Burns claimed that the extent of the accumulated tension was so high that a train wreck, as he called it, was likely to happen. Russia was bound to clash with the US on one of these issues, so he urged Washington to put forward to the Russians not three altogether, but one of them at a time. This proposal fell on deaf ears, but the very phrasing of the question, Russia will accept everything, the main thing is to break the bad news bit by bit, is very typical of the American approach to Russian interests in Eurasia as a whole and in Europe in particular. This logic is based on thinking from a position of strength, on the thinking of the hegemon in a unipolar world. If we were to summarize Russian-American relations with a single metaphor, a good metaphor can be found in Vladimir Putin's dialogue with George W. Bush on the issue of the deployment of the American missile defense system in Europe. Putin, who was on friendly terms with Bush, asked him, "George, look, why are you putting a missile defense system in Europe when you say it's against Iran? Wouldn't it make more sense to put it closer to that country, somewhere in the Middle East or the Caucasus?" A little later, Russia even suggested creating a joint missile defense system using Russian infrastructure in the Caucasus. But America didn't go for this at the time. Vladimir Putin sealed his speech with the argument that if missile defense system was deployed, Russia would be forced to create a counter-threat, for example, deploy weapons in Kaliningrad or take other steps to level out the risks. Having heard these reasonable arguments, which he was, by the way, already tired of hearing, George Bush responded with a three-part formula. He said, "Vladimir, we're not enemies. So you do what you want, and we will do what we want." The correct way to read this formula is as follows. We are not enemies, that is, we will not intentionally act against your interests. What we do is aimed not against Russia, but against others. We mostly seek to pursue our own interests, so it has nothing to do with you. But if your interests are affected as a result, sorry, we didn't mean it, but life is complicated. The do whatever you want part means that whatever you do, the disparity of our potentials is so great that it won't hurt us in any way, so do whatever you want. You are too weak to cause us harm anyway. And the third part, we'll do what we want, means that we don't think you have the right to veto any of our moves or actions. This is the pure logic of the unipolar moment, with which Russia, of course, has never agreed, despite Bush and Putin being on friendly terms. And in the light of the events that proceeded to unfold, Russia saw not only American arrogance, but also a strategic mistake. Our country's position, its analytical conclusions about the development of international processes indicated that polycentricity and multipolarity are more than just figures of speech. As other centers of power emerge with their interests completely autonomous from the West and the United States, they will be set and ready to defend their interests, including by force. And not only Russia, other countries as well. Against that background, America pursuing a one-sided policy of pressure with only a stick and no carrots, in fact departs from its classic Cold War containment strategy, where it was important to have a large group of neutral countries that would give token support to the United States, but without taking part in the military and political alliance. We can clearly see this strategy of pressure right now, when the US would be better served if it didn't put pressure on China, but on the contrary, create an environment conducive to China distancing itself from Moscow, if we take the American perspective. But apparently, their analytical mistake is that they are trying to perpetuate this unipolar moment, this unipolar dominance by force, whatever the cost. What this leads to is an erosion of America's global leadership. In general, for many countries, although not for Russia, the US-centered international system was quite comfortable. But in fact, the United States is undercutting the consensus around the leadership with its own fair hands. It is also breaking down the international institutions that have been the cornerstone of the international system since World War II and the end of the Cold War. This also applies to values. Americans do not take into account how diverse the world is, how different the Indian, Japanese, Chinese, Turkish, Brazilian, or Russian worldviews are from the Western paradigm and perception. The question of values or civilizational differences, as some may put it, is coming to the fore and becoming the driving force behind these countries' policies. The US approach to its military allies is pragmatic, even cynical to an extent. In fact, these alliances are increasingly used as mere tools. For example, to sell a batch of large submarines, you can form a nice military alliance with Australia while disregarding the interests of allied France by excluding Paris from this tenor. When coalitions they create for the occasion, coalition of the willing, essentially become a consequence or a tool of legitimizing a kind of unilateral American action. This, of course, starts to cause dull irritation. And now we are faced with a somewhat philosophical question. How would the other side act in America's shoes if, for an extended period of time, no country could oppose it, contain it, afford to say no, or prevent some of America's actions? Apparently, human nature pushes us to experiment until we run into a brick wall and then, fearing for our life, begin to avoid this kind of behavior. Actually, this policy of unilateral pressure created a situation in which, realizing it couldn't afford a war with Russia, America began to expand its pressure toolbox that would allow it to damage Russian interests without military confrontation. We are talking information provocation, economic pressure, and sanction regime which took its final shape long before the Ukrainian crisis and which now is simply operating on a much larger scale following the same guidelines. In fact, long before the Ukrainian crisis, sanctions were used as a tool of containing Russia, defeating Russian national interests, rights. They were a form of an illegal trade barrier. And of course, the myriad of sanctions and information provocations we have been seeing amid the Ukrainian crisis show the length this tactic has gone to today. If we compare that with our country's position, with what we consider optimal for the relations with the United States and what the model relationship would look like for us, Russia's understanding of international processes. If we describe the content of Russia's strategic documents metaphorically, the foreign policy concept, the national security strategy, the military doctrine, is that there are several significant political, military, economic centers of gravity in the world, and their common goal is to maintain world order. And a good metaphor is Atlantis holding the sky, each major country being responsible for one section of the sky. When Atlantis start fighting each other, they prevent each other from upholding their section of the sky. Thus, they switch from their primary task, holding the sky, to a secondary one, fighting other Atlantis, and eventually the global order collapses. This, of course, is a more static concept than the Americans' concept of history moving in a certain direction, which is dynamic. But I think that Russian vision, which is shared by other countries, China, India, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, is more true to life, more realistic. That is, if we look at international relations from a scientific perspective, the quintessential scientific understanding of how countries regulate their conflicts was in fact established by the ancient Greeks. Thucydides, to be precise, when describing the rivalry between Sparta and Athens, the balance of power potentials, the search for a point where interests are balanced, a compromise that has to be based on the understanding that one's political goal can no longer be achieved by military means. This, I think, is the idea which is closest to the laws of natural science, the quintessence of the vast experience of humanity conveyed through the science of international relations. And the Russian concept plays into this experience, this quintessential scientific knowledge, much better than America's deterministic end of history concept. And if we take a look at the examples of this concept in action, Russian-Chinese relations, especially in Central Asia, serve as an excellent illustration. Russia and China are located on the same continent, Eurasia, and share a rather long border. What helps is that the main areas in the two countries that produce added value, that are sources of GDP growth, Russia's and China population centers are located far from each other. 70% of Russia's GDP and population are located in the European part, and 70% of China's GDP and population are located diagonally along the Pacific coast. So Russia borders on China's lesser developed regions, which are facing population decline rather than its increase. And the fact that Russia and China stand, so to speak, back to back, with the vector of Russia's attention and interest directed westward and China's toward the Pacific Ocean, of course, helps a lot. Nevertheless, history has seen multiple conflicts and wars between Russia and China, including quite bloody ones, and both countries are well aware that they can seriously hurt each other. The relations between Russia and China rest on their shared understanding of the fact that they may, under certain circumstances, become rivals. Moreover, there have been a few unsettled territorial disputes which fortunately have been successfully resolved. But this painful experience gave the two countries an understanding of the fragility of peace and stability in the region and taught them to adopt a cautious, judicious attitude towards each other. There is no great love or sympathy between Russia and China. The countries do not see each other as friends or relatives. When crossing the Russian-Chinese border, for instance, a Russian person realizes that they are a European, and everything around is very different from what they are normally used to seeing in the European part of their country. Of course, when coming to the European Union, a Russian person understands that what they see is also quite different from their experience. The Russian identity is quite different from the European identity as it was formed under special historical conditions, but the gap between Russia and China is significantly greater, which helped shape the experience of caution in Russian-Chinese relations. These relations are based on the principles of sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, non-interference in each other's affairs, relations of equality which has been practically impossible to achieve with the United States, as well as mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence, and respect for international law. I think that if these conditions could be implemented in Russian-American relations, it would be a good enough basis for peace between our countries. But take, for example, the principle of non-interference. Are Americans prepared not to interfere in Russia's domestic affairs? I think the answer here is obvious. Are they ready for equality? They aren't. Whereas the 1997 declaration signed by Russia and China envisaged a new type of relations between states. They proposed a model for other countries, hoping that over time it could become the new global norm. The declaration also mentions the fact that differences in social systems, ideologies, or systems of values cannot be obstacle to normal relations between states. And of course, all these ideas fundamentally contradict the thesis that history has one direction and that there is only one idea that can unite everyone, with all international processes moving towards that end point. We are gradually approaching the breakdown of the system that has existed in Europe since the end of the Cold War. We are happy to have here with us today our professors who teach courses on the history of international relations and contemporary international relations. I'm generally all in favor of teaching our students, the students of the School of ER, the principle of historicism as the basis for studying international relations. MGIMO students and graduates should be able to put what is happening right now in the constant context of long-lasting trends and historical events. They should also be able to see the patterns leading to this situation. Unfortunately, this is not at all facilitated by the informatization and digitalization of our lives. We are all anxiously watching the world through news sites and Telegram channels that manipulate our attention. In fact, it's their currency. The more page views they have, the better for them. It's all about sensations and nothing else. The principle of historicism tells a different story. There is little new in what's going, but there are many recurrent patterns and many things logically follow one another. It is necessary to understand the logic of these events correctly if you are going to try to influence them. We can assume, if history is any guide, that the current crisis is bound to culminate in large-scale negotiations on a new system of relations in Europe, with the main participants likely being Russia and the United States. As we can now see from US behavior, it is deliberately making some symbolic steps that must be interpreted as steps towards de-escalation. In fact, that was the logic behind its behavior during the most acute phases of the Cold War crisis. For example, we can cite today's prisoner swap, with the pilot Konstantin Yeroshenko being exchanged for the American ex-Marine Trevor Reed, which took place at the peak of the crisis. Prior to that, Trevor Reed had been in a Russian prison for almost 4 years, while Yeroshenko had been jailed in America for over 12 years. Why now? And the exchange is taking place in a third country, just like in the Bridge of Spies. In the novel, two delegations compromise with each other and exchange citizens. This is a textbook example of Cold War practices. Last week, the United States announced a unilateral moratorium on testing anti-satellite weapons. Never mind that they have already tested, adopted, and could actively use them. Symbolically, this shows that they are sort of taking a step back. Before that, 2 weeks ago, they cancelled a pre-planned test of a new type of missile that was supposed to strengthen the nuclear triad. They are trying to avoid a situation reminiscent of the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy suddenly learned that an American nuclear weapon had been tested somewhere in the Pacific. He called up the military, asked who had given the order and why it had been done, and they answered that it was a scheduled test that had been planned long before. It just so happened that such a step was taken during the acute phase of the crisis, which of course was regarded by Moscow as a step of escalation. I believe that these negotiations with the United States and security in Europe will be led by the Russian delegations, with representatives of European countries joining the process only in its second phase. The reason for this is that European leadership has taken a position that can only be called a vacation from strategic thinking. Not a single European country thinks in the categories of power politics, responsible military behavior, or grand strategy anymore. The reason is that after the end of the World War II, it was the US that became the main military guarantor for the countries of Western Europe, that is, NATO countries, and then extended these military guarantees to the former countries of the Warsaw Treaty Organization. Most of them felt comfortable not being burdened by high levels of military spending, as well as having no active foreign policy that could potentially lead to conflicts and crises. And except maybe France and the UK, they all refrained from pursuing an active foreign policy. As for France and Britain, at a fairly early stage of the Cold War after the Suez Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union let them know that the world had become bipolar, so they also withdrew, or at least became second-league players in world politics. Britain is now actively following the lead of the United States, and while France can not but follow the United States, it is still trying to pursue a path resembling autonomy. This vacation from strategic thinking is an illusion, and a very dangerous one, in my opinion, for any country, allowing itself to be mentally calm by thinking that the world is completely safe and there will never be another military or political crisis. This approach creates an environment where it is easier for Russia to discuss the crisis with American experts rather than with European ones. The latter tend to have very emotional reactions. They are not ready to listen. Of course, we want to ask them, do you think you can afford not to talk to us now? Can you afford these emotional reactions? Do you understand what we are talking about? Do you understand the seriousness of the European security issues? Of course, it's once again a question of human nature, how quickly we get used to good things and how hard it is for us to overcome painful experiences, and that, unfortunately, before it gets any better, it will get worse. A rather unexpected but important example to mention here is Turkey's policy, which, despite being a member of NATO and working towards their strategic goal of joining the European Union, manages to pursue a completely autonomous policy, different from both the United States and Western Europe. Turkey is actively using its armed forces, takes real action, even undertakes military operations in almost all directions: Syria, northern Iraq, Cyprus, Nagorno-Karabakh. There was a crisis with Russia in 2015, which almost turned into regional confrontation. At one point, Turkey also used force against its NATO ally, Greece. So, what makes Turkey different, and why hasn't it joined the European countries on their vacation from strategic thinking? Turkey, to use a card game term, plays for its own money. It is fully responsible for all its actions. If Russia had delivered a substantial military strike against Turkey in 2015, it is unclear whether Article 5 of the NATO Charter would have been applied. This is very invigorating for the Turkish elites, as they realize that their weight of this active foreign policy rests entirely on their shoulders and that they will be the ones to pay for it. I assume that the negotiations on the new security system in Europe will include the items Russian diplomacy proposed to the United States and NATO in November and December. In general, all these items have been on the agenda for 30 years, and if there is one positive consequence of the Ukrainian crisis, or at least its more acute phase now, it will be a new, stronger security system in Europe, even if it is based on mutual hostility, deterrence, or forward basing. And apparently, the 1997 Russia-NATO Founding Act will fall victim to the current events. But this new system will incorporate the best practices of the Cold War: mutually reserved behavior, awareness that any incident might provoke a major military crisis, an acute understanding of the fact that our countries have a lot to lose. I think our Western colleagues lack this understanding, this sense of a pre-war situation before this crisis. In fact, the entire last year and the year before resembled some kind of pre-war situation if we take a look at the news on the situation on Russia's western border. NATO warplane overflights, ships sailing in violation of the state border. Take for instance, a British destroyer deliberately sailing close to Crimea, constant information provocations, active economic sanctions, and massive weapon supplies to Ukraine. Things have gotten absolutely ridiculous. In July 2021, Spanish military jets were stationed in Lithuania. So, Spanish Prime Minister, together with Lithuanian President, came to see them. They gave a press conference at the airbase against the background of the aircraft hangars. The conference was broadcasted on national television and Euronews. Suddenly, right in the middle of the press conference, the military alarm went off. The officials ran out in terror, the planes came out of the hangars and onto the runway, supposedly due to the launch of a Russian warplane. Here, there is a sense of suspense in a pre-war situation. It is a typical information provocation the Lithuanians apparently decided to arrange. This sense of impunity for provocative behavior against our country must cease once and for all. They should be held accountable for such reckless and rude steps. Of course, the crisis is now in its very acute phase. It is a military crisis with a significant number of casualties, but in many respects, Russia's military behavior is still extremely reserved and cautious. The president's statement today signals that this reserve has a limit, though. He's asking his opponents to return to good judgment. After all, the situation before the 24th of February was a political and diplomatic dead end. Americans and Europeans refused to discuss structural issues of European security with us based on the premise that Russia is not only on the wrong side of history, but also a declining power, a country that will inevitably lose its foreign policy way. For a certain period of time, Russia can just be ignored. The Russians will come to their senses and all that. And what about Biden's insulting statement when he responded to Russia's written demands for security guarantees at a press conference by saying that they won't give any written guarantees and we would just have to take their word for it? So for the last 30 years, we have sincerely believed all this, and it is what ultimately led us to the situation in which we are today. Looking at the second layer of this crisis, which is Russian-Ukrainian relations, we can state that this crisis is of a delayed nature. All post-Soviet states were, in a way, state experiments. In general, there is a scientific concept that views all states as open-ended experiments. The viability and success of the experiment depend on the persistence, rationality, good judgment, and priorities national elites have, as well as the resources that they are ready to spend on these priorities and the internal consensus of civil society within these countries. All post-Soviet states seem very different by all of these standards. Some, like Ukraine and Georgia, could not but take advantage of a very tempting and effective tool for internal mobilization, which is nationalism, especially in its extreme manifestations, when people are divided into first- and second-class citizens. First-class citizens are ideologically loyal, support the correct system of values, gestures, language, historical metaphors, and symbols. And those in the minority need to be re-educated. As a friend of mine from Kharkiv wrote on Facebook, his child came to daycare on a national holiday, but did not wear a Ukrainian national costume and was excluded from the celebration along with a group of other children. He had to watch the performance as a viewer while other kids participated in it. This division into first- and second-class citizens is extremely destructive to Ukrainian politics. I believe that if Russia were to follow the path of such Russian ethnic nationalism, a similar trajectory could await us. But our political environment and system relies on the consensus of all citizens, all peoples and nations. For Russia, what is happening in Ukraine is only partly a matter of foreign policy. As for Ukraine, what is happening in Russia is also only partly a matter of its foreign policy. To a great extent, it is a question of domestic policy too. Any Russian news that interests our citizens is likely to affect Ukrainians as well, from soccer to major accomplishments or tragedies. It's the same in Ukraine when there is some kind of discrimination against the members of the Russian community or Russian identity, when their churches are taken away, opposition media shut down, Politicians disappear, journalists are killed, children are not allowed into daycare, students cannot study in Russian, or people cannot hold a Victory Day parade on the 9th of May. It becomes big news here in our country, and any critic of the government can come out and say, why is our government not doing enough to protect our people in Ukraine? In this experiment, this quest for the foundations of its statehood, Ukraine has been facing a formidable challenge since the early 90s. How to make the two pillars of Ukrainian statehood, the people of Ukrainian and Russian identity, feel equally comfortable. How to build an inclusive system where their rights are respected. Unfortunately, due to the wobbly nature of Ukrainian politics, the great role of oligarchic capital, oligarch-owned media manipulations, and the crisis-like nature of each electoral cycle, every election still runs up against some major crisis on a local, regional, even international scale. The elites started to pit Russian and Ukrainian identity elements in politics against each other quite early on, practically since the early 90s. This eventually led to them adopting a domination course, accentuating the Ukrainian identity and ousting the Russian identity along with its symbols and citizens. In this fight, the so-called Galician consensus, the people of Western Ukraine, who consider pro-Western orientation as the main pillar of Ukrainian statehood, adopted a particular dialect of the Ukrainian language, the system of historical signs and symbols in support of those who fought against the Soviet Union on the side of Nazi Germany during the Great Patriotic War. This was later codified in public policy. For instance, teaching in Russian and teaching of the Russian languages was cut, and the use of Russian in formal appeals to the authorities was prohibited. Ukraine's foreign policy aim of joining NATO was the most obvious external manifestation of the domestic policy the elites in Kyiv had taken on quite a while ago. This aim in itself already posed a security threat to Russia. What Russian leaders call the military expansion of NATO to the Ukrainian territory should not be treated as a light metaphor. From our country's standpoint, this is quite a painful system of relations that turns Ukraine into a military springboard for an offensive against our country. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after Russia, with a population of about 40 million people. The armed forces of Ukraine consist of about 220,000–240,000 people. If we count the employees of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the State Border Guard Service, and other special services, this number can amount to 450,000. In comparison, Russian armed forces only consist of 1 military people, so even in terms of quantitative balance, Ukraine is a strong competitor. Its army is the third largest in Europe after Russia and Turkey, if we regard Turkey as a European country. And seeing Ukraine's significant potential to contain Russia and the triumph of representatives of the Galician consensus, the West has chosen to support these forces in order to form a militarily counterweight to Russia in Eastern Europe. If this had proved successful, the goal of focusing our country's attention on its cousin country that has military and political plans against it could have been achieved. A whole series of military agreements signed by the United States, Britain, and NATO with Ukraine led to the fact that Ukraine, especially after 2014, began to actively pursue militarization. Ukraine's military budget skyrocketed to almost 6% of its GDP. This is comparable to Israel's military spending. And Israel is in a very difficult international environment and is forced to defend itself from all its neighbors, constantly waging wars against them. Ukraine has even started speculating about the possibility of rapid nuclear weapon development, especially of a dirty bomb. Many Western experts have taken this lightheartedly, saying that the West would never allow Ukraine to create these weapons. But the facts tell a completely different story. A month ago, Russian prankers called the UK Defense Secretary and started asking him questions on behalf of the Ukrainian defense minister, saying in particular that they wanted to create their own nuclear program. He swallowed a lump in his throat and replied that this was, of course, an unexpected phrasing of the question, but the Western partners are always ready to support their Ukrainian friends in any endeavor. For the West, of course, the creation of such a system of relations is an extremely fortunate development. Basically, it is possible to quite safely, without taking any responsibility for the security of Ukraine, supply it with weapons and make Russia pay undivided attention to it. In general, the goals of these bilateral relations are not even hidden. For example, the August document between the US and Ukraine states that military and technical cooperation is aimed at improving Ukraine's military capabilities to ensure its territorial integrity and increase interoperability with NATO. So the issue on the table is Donbas and Crimea, and more specifically, it is effective cooperation against Russian aggression, including active training and military drills. That is, the goal is not just poorly concealed, it is openly declared, actively postulated, and it seems that we should take this document quite literally. This goal is promoted by the United States itself. Britain is not too far behind the United States in this regard. Ultimately, they see this as an excellent opportunity. In some ways, they must have recognized in this Russian-Ukraine dichotomy a familiar system that resembles, although not too closely, the India-Pakistan relationship. Both countries date back to the same time of the collapse of the British Empire. For Pakistan, the confrontation with India was the formative experience all social processes began to develop around. The military has come to play a dominant role in its domestic policy, with yet another episode of its active involvement taking place just 2 weeks ago. Pakistan's inter-services intelligence is so active, in fact, that it might as well have its own foreign policy course, assisting the Taliban and bringing them to power in Afghanistan, developing a network of underground camps to carry out sabotage on the Indian territory, not to mention the fact that India and Pakistan have gone through a whole series of border conflicts, some of them quite bloody, by the way, and have both developed nuclear weapons. The two have created such a system of fundamental mutual deterrence that it essentially prevents India from taking any drastic steps against Pakistan. And apparently, the West saw the potential for creating a similar system of relations between Russia and Ukraine. I probably won't go into detail about the political divide in Ukraine described on the slides. Many of these facts are well known to you. They often appear in various speeches, and I think you can get this information from open sources now. The question is how autonomous, how independent the Ukrainian leadership is, whether it is an American client forced to do only what Washington says. This is a very important question, and I don't think it's that simple. Ukraine does not always listen when US leaders urge to be reserved or not to provoke the Russians. There is a famous phone reprimand that Joe Biden, Vice President of the United States at the time, gave to Petro Poroshenko, President of Ukraine, for his military provocation on the border with Crimea. At the time, a group of Ukrainian saboteurs tried to carry out a terrorist attack, but they were ambushed, some of them killed, and none of this was coordinated with the United States. This could have led to a major Russian-Ukrainian crisis, and as the Ukrainians did it of their own accord, Biden reprimanded Poroshenko on the phone. The recording of this call was later made public. In 2015, when addressing the government in the Verkhovna Rada in Kiev, Biden put across an overall correct message about not forcing Russians out of political life and about the importance of building an inclusive system. He spoke in biblical metaphors, and if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. He advised not to ban Russian channels or political parties and to focus on building a united country instead. But Poroshenko and later Zelensky, who came to power with roughly the same slogans, eventually realized that it would be most effective for them to rely on nationalists and work for the benefit of the Galician consensus. But Ukraine is in a peculiar situation right now. Zelensky may garner a lot of attention as president of a war-stricken country, but the moment the hostilities in Ukraine end, the same political issues that have been present in this country for decades will resurface. Elite groups will continue fighting for power, accuse the president of making mistakes, a lot of which have been made during the crisis. Sometimes it seems that people in Kiev do not realize that the currency they used to pay the West for this preferential, privileged treatment is, in fact, the Ukrainian territories. The first version of Russia's diplomatic proposals for Ukraine, made in the first week of the crisis, is likely to change closer to the end. Let's now move on to the possible outcome scenarios. 3 such key scenarios might emerge. The first was proposed by the Russian leadership immediately at the onset of the active phase of the crisis, on the 25th or 26th of February. According to this scenario, the goal is to reach an agreement with the current Ukrainian political leadership. The package deal should, at the same time, recognize Ukraine's neutrality as enshrined in the constitution, recognize Crimea as Russian territory, recognize Donbas as independent, and put aside or ignore the issue of Ukrainian sovereignty over these territories. Apparently, it was the willingness of the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul to agree to this formula that gave the Russian leadership reason to be optimistic about a diplomatic settlement at the time. Among other things, certain military steps were taken. Moscow is now convinced that the Ukrainians, whether of their own accord or with the West edging them on, have decided to drag this crisis out, thinking that time is on their side, that they will most definitely win, and that there is a good chance that Russian interests will ultimately be crushed. And this brings us to the second scenario. The first scenario was convenient for everyone in that the agreement would have to be signed with a legitimate Ukrainian government, which was legitimately elected by the Ukrainian people, meaning that this agreement could not but be perceived as legitimate by Ukraine's allies in the West. And overall, it could be used as a platform to return to resolving the situation by diplomatic means, but with a twist. Discuss the problem of European security before the Ukrainian crisis begins to turn into a completely catastrophic militarist scenario. However, we can see that this phase has passed and the second phase is approaching. In this phase, the results of negotiations will be dictated by the situation on the ground. This is the premise both Russia and the United States stand on. The Ukrainians, I believe, are deluded as to what effect the arms being shipped to them from the West will have. at the moment, the situation at the front is bad for them. So they are shifting public attention to propaganda, for instance, the fact that old Polish tanks or American missile systems will soon arrive and the offensive will begin anew. There are, of course, tangible attacks on Russian territory, and this scenario is too sensitive for Russia to rule out the possibility of targeting the decision-making center in Kyiv. The development of the second scenario will in fact heavily depend on how the military situation on the ground develops, which specific territories will be under Russian control by the time Ukraine is seriously ready to discuss peace once again. Will there be the same president who leads Ukraine now? These are just questions, hypotheses, so there is no clarity here. Besides, in this scenario, there is a risk that the West will not accept the new agreement, and it will take a considerable amount of time, from several years to maybe a decade, for a large gray zone, which will not be legalized or codified in any way, to appear in the east of Europe, and become a testing ground for building a new European security system. The third scenario, which in my opinion is less likely but still impossible to completely rule out, is the most dangerous one. The West, which is already using Ukraine as a tool, it is largely indifferent to what specific borders Ukraine will have after the crisis and how many people will remain there. The West will follow the logic of inflicting damage on Russia by all means, minimizing, of course, the negative consequences for itself. Here, we are talking not only about a military strike at some Russian regions, which, of course, immediately raises the question of the possibility of a nuclear war between us, but mainly about internal political destabilization, revisiting the techniques and methods the West used in the post-Soviet space and in Russia to provoke domestic discontent, support the opposition, and prepare a color revolution in order to shift Russia's attention from foreign to domestic policy. Of course, this is one of the most common expected scenarios. I believe that Moscow understands that in this already very serious game, which is now becoming strategic, the West will use all the tools. But I still believe that this scenario is not the most likely, as the United States knows that Ukrainian resources are finite and understands that the only thing that makes this conflict so long is the fact that Russia is essentially fighting half-hearted. If Russian troops conducted military operations the way the US troops did, say, in Iraq in 2003, we would now be seeing any undestroyed buildings in Mariupol. There would be only bare walls and piles of bricks and concrete instead. In 2004, when they stormed Raqqa, American soldiers simply razed the city to the ground. I realize how cynical this may sound, and I'm aware of that. But for all the terror of death and the fact that war is always a tragedy and a disaster, the surgical precision of Russian strikes for a military theater of this scale is still unprecedented. That is, no country has ever conducted such a carefully thought-out operation in such an enormous war theater. Some American analysts give due credit to the Russian way of waging this war, and even do so publicly. This lecture takes place on the 27th of April of 2022, when the balance of the parties' interests has not yet been found, and a military outcome is not yet obvious. and it is not, most importantly, the only possible outcome. Russia would be ready to return to the first scenario, maybe with some adjustments, if Kiev asked for peace now. But the situation is developing every day. Today, Russian Foreign Minister responded to a question about the possibility of referendums on independence in the Donbass by saying that the fate of Ukraine will be decided by the Ukrainian people, but not ruling out such a scenario. The final form of the Russian proposal to Kiev, which will emerge at the end of the acute phase of the crisis, I believe might be significantly different from the one that was devised during the first phase of the war. Let's hope that common sense will prevail and history will do us good this time, teaching everyone a valuable lesson. Finally, let's hope that this crisis, as one of its few positive consequences, will provide an opportunity to finally establish a lasting security system in Europe, even if the result of this process can be seen only in the long term. Thank you very much for your attention.